Hello, and thank you to Pecan for inviting me to speak once again at your annual meeting. I'm honored to be here. I'm Catherine Clark, and I am the managing editor of Pecan South, the official trade magazine for the pecan industry. And today we're going to dive into the Northern Hemisphere's 2024 crop and specifically look at pecan production as a whole and the various commercial aspects that come into play. But before I begin, it's important that we note that I am currently recording this at the end of July. And so when all of you watch this presentation in October, growers in the US and Mexico will actually be in the middle of harvesting their 2024 crop. And so from now until then, a lot can happen with the crop. And as you all know, a lot of things can change. And so some of the predictions I'm going to make later in this presentation, some of the comments I'll make about the harvest and the crop, you'll be able to see just how that's changed and just how that's been affected over the last few months. So let's go ahead and dive in. And first, let's establish an understanding of the pecan production regions in the Northern Hemisphere. So the United States and Mexico make up two of the largest pecan producers in the world, and North America alone produces at least 75% of the world's supply. Some experts actually estimate that these two countries produce about 90% of the world's pecan supply. And the reason the majority of the world's supply comes from North America is pretty much because pecans are indigenous to this continent. And the tree's native range stretches all along the Mississippi River Valley from the Midwestern United States far south into Mexico. Now, the map on this slide comes from Dr. L.J. Grauke, and his article is titled Family Trees, Roots, and Resilience, and it can be found in the June 2019 issue of Pecan South. So looking here, you'll see that the native range for pecans is highlighted in green, and then the commercial range is highlighted in gray. And you can see that there's a lot of overlap between the native and commercial range. And we see also that the commercial range has spread considerably and now stretches across 15 states of the United States and at least 4 states in Mexico. In the US, pecans are primarily grown in 15 states, and this is often called the Pecan Belt, and it stretches from the east all the way to the west coast. And the top 3 producers in the US are Georgia, New Mexico, and Texas. Georgia's over here, right above Florida. Then we have Texas, and then New Mexico is right to the west of Texas. Now, Georgia and New Mexico have been battling for that top spot that image of being the top producing state in the US for the last decade. And it is important to note that Arizona, which is west of New Mexico, has slowly gained ground and is now considered one of the top producing states in the US. And last year, Arizona actually outpaced Texas in terms of yield. One other quick thing I want to note before we move on is that the western region of the US, over here you have West Texas, New Mexico, Arizona. This yields the majority of the pecans in the US, and most shellers are actually located in the West, particularly in El Paso, Texas. And so while a lot of pecans are grown in the southeastern US, they do have to travel across the country to be shelled in the West before they go on the market. Now, in Mexico, about 60% of the pecans are grown in the border state of Chihuahua, and another 15% in each of the 2 other northern states, Coahuila and Sonora. And Mexico and the United States are constantly vying to be the top producing country. And in 2019, for the first time, Mexico actually produced more pecans than the United States. Now, as the years go on, we expect these 2 countries to continue to be big competitors. And this is going to just increase as more plantings enter production. When thinking about the North American pecan crop, we must always take into account native versus improved production. What do I mean when I say this? Well, I mentioned that pecans are indigenous to North America, and because of that, a portion of the region's production is impacted by what we call native pecan groves. These are pecan trees that grow out in the wild, and these trees are just naturally on a farmer's property or along river bottoms, or you can even find them in just neighborhoods or different cities throughout the country and the continent. You have producers, though, who work specifically with native pecans, and they'll work to rejuvenate, maintain, and harvest crop from these native trees. And that crop does not impact the total production numbers for each region, but it also impacts the market and prices. Additionally, we have improved varieties, and that's what you have in Argentina. They are propagated in grafted trees that are planted in orchards. And these hundreds of improved varieties, they make up the majority of the pecan crop worldwide. And they are usually commercially grown trees that we have all over the world. Now, further in my presentation, we'll look at specific crop estimates for this year. And during that portion of the talk, we will specifically discuss how native pecans play a big role in these production numbers and how they impact total yield for both the United States and Mexico. Additionally, it's important to note the seasonality of harvest. I talked about this last year a little bit. This has a big impact on global supply and demand and crop development. So for the US and Mexico, harvest takes place from September through January, sometimes into February as well. And different regions start and end harvest at different times. So Central and South Texas and parts of Mexico typically begin harvest first, and that's in early or mid-September. And some of these producers actually practice what is called green harvesting, where they shake trees when the shucks are still green and there are still leaves on the trees. These growers will then take the pecans, dehull them, so remove the shucks, dry them out, and then sell the majority of their crop on the retail or gift pack market, which is usually the holiday market. And they often receive the highest price. Now, once we hit October, growers in other parts of Texas, Georgia, and the southeastern United States also start to harvest, and harvest picks up in Mexico as well. West Texas and the western region of the US, as well as parts of Mexico, do not start harvesting until late November, and sometimes not even until after Christmas. And these growers wait until they get their first killing freeze before they harvest. So they wait until a freeze hits, knocks all the leaves off the trees, dries out the pecans, and then they'll rush into their fields and gather up all the crop that they can. And they typically sell their pecans on the commercial or wholesale market. So while thinking about this year's crop, it's also important that we acknowledge that there are more and more players entering the pecan industry. And so there are now pecan orchards in China and parts of Europe, specifically France and Spain. And although they're not major contenders yet, these orchards do contribute to global supply. The orchards in Europe are quite small, and the ones in China are generally planted in unfavorable conditions. So in China, planted orchards along hillsides or terraces or in poor soil. And the pecans grown in China will also most likely be used domestically to feed the Chinese people. So at this time, we don't quite know what production will look like in Europe and China, but it's there and it's growing. And if you want to learn more about these production regions, I encourage you to go to pecansouthmagazine.com. We have several articles in the past in Pecan South that discussed orchards in China, France, and Spain. And so that's a good resource to have. Now that we have the production basics out of the way, we can look further into the 2024 crop. So as you all know, a major determinant of the current production is last year's. And so on this slide, we see data from the USDA, the US Department of Agriculture, NASS, Non-Citrus Fruits and Nuts Summary. And this report is published every May and shows data on the most recent pecan crop. So here we can see the total amount of pecans reported for 2021, 2022, and 2023. It's also important to note that the USDA only reports on 5 of the 15 pecan producing states in the US. So these 5 states are Arizona, Georgia, New Mexico, Oklahoma, and Texas. And as I mentioned, they produce the majority of the US crop. I'm also going to make a quick note that there's a lot of contention surrounding these numbers. There are many people in the US pecan industry who feel like these numbers aren't entirely accurate and are a little uncertain about them. And so when we look at this data, I recommend we all take it with a grain of salt. We know that there's a lot of surveying that goes on in this data, but they may have not have done as much as they should in order to get proper numbers. Now, looking at these numbers, we know that last year there was extreme heat and a severe drought in the United States that lasted from May all through harvest, and it greatly reduced the crop for growers in Texas, Mexico, and parts of Oklahoma. Additionally, we have a lot of young trees starting to bear crops in Arizona, Georgia, and New Mexico. And so we see that those young trees helped to bolster these numbers, even when these states were on an off year. New Mexico, though, was on an on year last year, and they had a big crop. And this is actually the first time that they've gotten this close to Georgia. They've made 100 million pounds previously, but they've never broken 100 million pounds until last year. So overall, the US had a short crop last year, but total yield was more than originally forecasted. Additionally, what we can say about 2023 is that Mexico also harvested a smaller crop in 2023. And for several years, Mexican producers have experienced a water shortage, and this issue is just getting worse. There's extreme heat and drought that have exacerbated this water shortage over the last few years, and many Mexican growers reported poor nut fill and smaller nuts. Also, just make a quick note that Mexico was also originally forecasted to produce around 141.85 metric tons in 2023, but total yield was smaller than expected. So now when we're thinking about the 2024 crop, we know about 2023, what's going to happen this year? How do we know what production to anticipate in the current crop year? Well, we have crop estimates that helps us understand the yields and kind of gives us an idea of what to expect. In the US pecan industry, we use both data-based estimates as well as some industry estimates. The US Department of Agriculture releases two production estimates, one in January and one in October. And these reports are surveys, and they use data that they gather from growers around the country to determine these numbers. And these reports are also funded by the industry. Now, over the years, the USDA, as I mentioned, moved from reporting on all 15 pecan-producing states in the US to only sharing data on the top 5. And all these reports are publicly available, and you can find them through the link here. But again, take them with a grain of salt because they are just surveying growers for this data. Additionally, we have some pecan industry crop forecasts, which I'm going to get into shortly. And those are released in June, July, and September by 3 different pecan growing organizations in the US. Now, for global pecan supply, there's global production estimates that exist. And because we are recording this in July, many of these 2024 estimates have not been released yet. But here we can see last year's production estimates, and these figures come from a variety of sources from all over the world. And you'll note that the estimated yield for the US in 2023 from this chart was around 308 million pounds, which was very close to the official yield reported in May of this year, which was 306.7 million pounds. So I think this global estimate gives a really good idea of what the crop will be each year. Now we're going to look at this year's current crop forecasts. So if you look closely at the estimates from the US, you'll see we have 3 different organizations. We have the Tri-State Pecan Guesstimate, because we are guessing at an estimate. We have a forecast from the Texas Pecan Growers Association, and we also have an estimate from the National Pecan Shellers Association. These are done by different organizations leading up to harvest and rely on word of mouth and reviewing data to determine the coming year's production totals. So one thing to quickly note before I go on is that the National Pecan Shellers Association does not release its estimate until September. So I do not have the current estimate for you all, but in October, you'll be able to find that in Pecan South, as well as online through the National Pecan Shellers Association website. But we do have the 2 other estimates for 2024. And another thing to note, pecan shellers and growers often have differing opinions on the state of the crop, and their existing biases can influence this estimate. So when looking at these numbers, it's important to remember that oftentimes the shellers estimate will be larger than that of the growers. And so this year, the US crop overall is expected to be smaller than last year's. And although over the last few months, some areas of Texas have received plenty of rain, many orchards are still recovering from last year's drought. Growers are removing dead trees. They're seeing a lot of dieback in their trees, which is affecting the crop. And additionally, West Texas, one of the largest production regions in the United States, is expected to be in an off year. So they'll yield fewer pecans, but hopefully those pecans will be of higher quality. Georgia, as you can see by these estimates, we have 130 million pounds, 110 million pounds estimated. Georgia is expecting to have a huge crop this year, but they have one major concern, and that is hurricanes. Every Georgia grower you speak with will tell you this year's hurricane season is expected to be extremely volatile. There's a high possibility of several severe storms. And so even though their trees have a lot of pecans, there are a lot of concerns that this crop won't make it through harvest. And so that's just something to keep in mind as we're moving forward. Additionally, we see some other states, some smaller states like Florida, Louisiana, Alabama, they're expecting to produce less pecans than last year, but these states are also in regions where they can get impacted by hurricanes. So hurricanes, big uncertain factor that can greatly influence not only this year's crop, but the future crop as well. Additionally, Mexico is forecasted to have a smaller crop again this year. Their official forecast won't come out until later this year before harvest, around September, October. But again, they're attributing this smaller crop to some major production challenges, including water shortages. And so on to the challenges. So I mentioned that in 2019, Mexico outpaced the US in pecan production. Since then, there have been a lot of issues with accessing water in Mexico, and not only accessing water, but accessing high quality, good water that your trees want without any problems. And so since 2019, Mexican pecan producers have faced increasing water issues. And pecan consultant Robert Hatch and Dr. Humberto Nunez stated in an article in Pecan South and also in Nuestra Reña that on the coastal plain of Hermosillo, Sonora, water is pumped from the aquifer, which is barely maintaining its level by strict adherence to pumping quotas. In Chihuahua, many wells have been drilled and water levels continue to drop, end quote. So there's a huge water shortage. It's getting worse. And because of this, some growers in Mexico are selling their orchards and leaving the industry. Those who can afford it are drilling new wells and pumping more water or adjusting their irrigation. But water remains a major concern for growers, not only in Mexico, but around the world, particularly those in drier climate. And so here, one of our largest issues is climate change. We not only have a more intense hurricane season this year threatening the pecan crop, but I also mentioned drought, extreme heat, lack of water. These are major factors in North America that pecan producers are battling every single day and will battle for years to come. And so I mentioned earlier that the largest production regions in North America are in areas that are actually historically arid climates. New Mexico, Arizona, West Texas. Now these regions are just getting hotter and drier. And so growers are trying to figure out, okay, how can I grow pecans and keep them alive, keep the trees alive while everything just gets hotter and water becomes more scarce. Another challenge to pecan production in the Northern Hemisphere is pecan price, which has a great impact on production in North America, specifically when it comes to native pecans. So Oklahoma and Texas are two of the largest native pecan producers in the US, and Mexico also produces a lot of native nuts. During harvest time, if the price for natives falls below $1, growers will not harvest. They will just stop picking up nuts altogether. And if the price rebounds, some of them may return to their orchards later in the year to pick up nuts. But at that point, the crop may have been greatly diminished. The pecans may have been eaten by wild hogs or other varmints that might have been swept away by wind or rain, or simply just rotted back into the earth. And so price plays a big role on the native pecan harvest, which ultimately impacts total yield and production. Another major threat to pecan production in the Northern Hemisphere is urbanization. And y'all might also experience this in Argentina. Land values have risen astronomically, and cities and highways continue to encroach on farms. You have many farmers who now are neighbors to major highways, to asphalt plants, suburbs, or other industrial plants. And so they're trying to continue to grow pecans while dealing with this increased industrialization around them. Additionally, the pecan industry is made up of an aging demographic. It takes so much money to get started, that many young people are unable to start their own farms. You have a lack of young farmers entering the industry, and you also have a portion of farmers aging out. And some of these farmers, they just don't know who to pass their orchards on to. Their kids or grandkids might not be interested in farming, and so they're trying to figure out what the future of their farm looks like as they settle into retirement and old age. And so because of this, North America is actually losing a lot of productive orchards simply because there's no succession plan and because people are being bought out by real estate. You know, they're selling their farms because prices are so low. Lastly, one of the greatest challenges for pecan growers in the Northern Hemispheres is production costs. The cost to manage and grow pecans continues to increase year after year, and farmers are being pushed out of the industry. So with the current pecan market weak and prices low, you have many of these farmers who simply can't afford to stay in the industry. And so they're selling their farms for millions of dollars to pay off their debts, retire, and simply survive. Yet, I say this, it sounds like there's a lot of horrible things happening and the future is very bleak. But there's also a lot of hope. There are many growers who are getting creative to try and lower their production costs and sell more pecans. You have many who are turning to sustainable production methods, to regenerative agriculture, and they're seeing great success there. And then you have others who are investing in their own retail stores to sell directly to consumers and to connect with them that way and bump up their price. And still, you have other producers who are forming co-ops or pooling their pecans together to sell them as a group. And they're seeing success there to get a good price. Now, I mentioned that there's hope, and it's not just individual farmers who are coming up with creative solutions. The industry around the world, in the US, Mexico, Argentina, all over, is working on various projects to adapt to climate change, to protect the land, and to attract young talent into the industry. And the pecan offers so many amazing health benefits. We all know this. That's why we love it. That's why we are dedicated to growing it and sharing it with the world. And as the industry continues to connect with new consumers, we'll continue to open up new doors that can help us increase production and help us support each other better through these tough times and these challenges. And so to conclude my presentation, I wanted to take a moment to share some ways that you can stay informed as you continue to navigate the pecan business. I mentioned Pecan South a few times. This is a fantastic resource. There's not only management advice in there, but also industry news, insight into other production regions. And we have several articles that discuss production in the United States, Mexico, and other countries. And so you can use that as a way to get informed and to educate yourself. Additionally, if you want to know more about what's happening in the Northern Hemisphere this October and November, you can check out the Pecan newsletter, which we publish weekly from September through January. And although it primarily reports on the US and Mexico harvest and crop, it does cover prices, market conditions, and other tree nuts. So like I said, you could get a global view of what's happening during our harvest, so you know what to prepare for when it's your time to harvest. I also suggest checking out the American Pecan Council's position reports and the USDA pecan reports and cold storage reports. These last 3 bullet points all provide data on the US crop and on the market, and they give you an insight into inventory, export, all of that, so you can know what's going on there. And lastly, we do have Nuestra, which is our annual Spanish magazine, Spanish language magazine. And if that interests you, it's free on our website. You could download your copy, and it's another great resource. So thank you again to Capican for this opportunity. I really enjoyed getting to present to you all again this year, and I'll welcome any questions if anyone has any.